I think I'm standing between you and the most interesting panel so far, or this morning. Would you please join me in welcoming our next panel, Transition to Clean Energy Across the Mountain West. It will be Bill Ritter, former governor of Colorado, Duane Highley, TriState's CEO, Sarah Cottrell Propst, the cabinet secretary for New Mexico on energy, and Chad Teply, the senior vice president from PacifiCorp. Would you please welcome them to the stage?
Great to be with you this morning on this bright Monday morning. So we've all been introduced already, but Chad with PacifiCorp is on the far end, Duane in the middle, TriState, Sarah's with the state of New Mexico. And so this morning, we know it's a solar and storage conference, but we thought in this panel what we would do is sort of take a broad look at energy transitions in the West, in the Rocky Mountain West. And we have two people from major utilities in the West and a woman who works for a governor who's been part of that transition. And so I think, Duane, if we can start with you, full disclosure, Duane asked me about 7 or 8 months ago if my group at Colorado State University would actually convene a stakeholder group for their transition that they're in the middle of. And so I know a little bit about this. Sarah was part of the group, so she knows a lot about it. And so, Duane, explain a little bit about TriState, about what portfolio you have and kind of your business model, but then a little bit about how you are transitioning and what brought that about.
Yeah, so thank you so much, and thank you for helping us with the energy transition process. I've been on board with TriState since April 1st, which is April Fool's Day, so that's the right day to start a new job, right? And since then, I've been hitting the ground running to assist TriState in making a grid energy transition. So TriState is a nonprofit wholesale power supplier that supplies 43 electric cooperative members across 4 states, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. So we serve members through our member systems all the way from the Montana border down to the Mexican border. And about 1.2 million people, over 200,000 square miles of territory. So that's an area larger than the state of California, but you can imagine the density is very, very low for a utility when we're talking about just 1 million people over that amount of landscape. So TriState serves those wholesale providers in a nonprofit business manner, and so we do respond to our members. They come and meet in our boardroom every month, democratically elected representatives of the people we serve. Every one of them a ratepayer, every one of them that cares a lot about reliability and affordability. So for TriState, the question was, how fast can we transition the grid? How fast can we change our energy mix while respecting reliability and affordability? And with the help of Governor Ritter and the stakeholder group, we explored various options and eventually got to what we think is a pretty strong commitment for grid energy transition by 2030. Now that starts with the build out of over 1,000 megawatts of new renewables between now and 2023 that will drive us to 50% renewable energy by the year 2024. So half the energy served across our 4-state footprint will be renewable, wind, solar, hydro, and we'll get there without any increase in rates. In fact, the new renewables are coming online are so much below the cost of any fossil-fueled plant that we'd operate, it helps us accelerate the retirement of coal. And that was also announced, thank you, that was also announced as part of this grid energy transition. So all the coal that TriState operates will be retired. That's the Escalante plant in New Mexico, which Sarah is very familiar with. That plant will be closing at the end of this year. The Nuclear plant, which was in Colorado, was announced to close last year. That was early because it was scheduled for 2022 closure. It closed at the end of 2019. And at Craig, Colorado, TriState is committed to closing the plant and the mine by 2030. That will result in a 90% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions within the state of Colorado on all the plants that TriState operates, gas and coal, based on a 2005 baseline, so 90% reduction from 2005 by the year 2030. When you look at the energy that's imported into Colorado, so Colorado does not make all the energy that it consumes. We won't increase imports. We also won't be able to drastically decrease imports because of the need to preserve reliability, but it does mean a 70% reduction in the carbon content of energy delivered to Colorado by the year 2030. So that's what we call our 90-70 plan, 90% reduction of in-state resources, 70% reduction in carbon dioxide content delivered to member systems within the state of Colorado by 2030. That's something we've been talking about, something we might be interested in seeing legislation that would support our commitment and solidify our commitment to the state and solidify the state's commitment to us. In addition, we've announced the formation of the Beneficial Electrification League of Colorado in conjunction with NRDC and the governor's office. We're also pursuing the same thing in the state of New Mexico as a Beneficial Electrification League. What am I missing? Oh, RTOs. We're advancing the cause of regional transmission organizations in the West by announcing our move with Basin and WAPA to join the Southwest Power Pool's Energy Imbalance Service. This is a sub-hourly market which will help us balance resources, but it's the first step towards a regional power market that will allow us to integrate renewables in a much larger way. So as we see ourselves moving from 50% renewable to the increasing percentages by the end of the decade, we know it's going to be necessary to have a regional market to support that movement of green renewable energy. So that's the Responsible Energy Plan in a nutshell, that we're grateful for the Center for New Energy Economy to assist us in getting that done.
We'll talk more about that.
We might talk more.
But Chad, I think it was 2018 when PacifiCorp sort of announced its first set of coal plant closures that were some early closures. And since then, you continue, I think, to work in a variety of states with that. So if you just talk about PacifiCorp, Rocky Mountain Power's transition, their Berkshire Hathaway companies, and sort of what's happening there as well. Some of the similarities perhaps to TriState, but some differences as well.
Sure. And first and foremost, I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today. It's always nice to get out and talk a little bit about what we think is a pretty exciting transition. We think we're leading out in the West as far as not only the implementation and deployment of renewables, but also this transition, the concepts of transition to a greener energy source and supply. PacifiCorp, for those of you that are less familiar, we operate in 6 states as far as customer groups go, but we actually have infrastructure across 10 states in the West. Our service territories are actually broken into 2 pieces. The Rocky Mountain Power business unit is based in Salt Lake City. That Rocky Mountain Power business unit covers Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho, a small piece of Idaho. And then we have a Pacific Power sister company that's based in Portland, Oregon. We have a small bit of territory in the state of Washington, and then an even smaller bit in the very northern part of California. So we operate in those 6 states. But beyond that, we have infrastructure. We have a partial ownership of coal facilities in Montana, in Colorado, the Craig Station that you just heard a little bit about, as well as the Hayden Station, and then the Cholla facility in Arizona, and just a bit of transmission in New Mexico, a very small piece. So from a transition perspective, very similar to what Duane shared, back in 2018, as we roll through a vertical integrated utility as a kind of structured and regimented resource planning process, as you can all imagine, that's actually vetted across all 6 states. So we have to find that balance, as you can imagine, with those states that I just listed, very different political drivers, very different economics and economy for each of those states. And then obviously, as you start to transition away from coal from a state like Wyoming, which is the source of most, as well as Montana and Utah, as you start to make those transitions for us, equal to the kind of the nuts and bolts of what are the new resources, it's how do I transition my employees? How do I transition these communities? Because if you think back, many of these facilities are now 50 and 60 years old, very much so generationally developed. A lot of the folks that are working in our plants today, especially on the coal front, are 3rd generation coal plant employees or mine employees. So that transition really becomes a tough pill to swallow in states like Wyoming in particular. We're doing our best to get out ahead of that transition with those communities. As I mentioned, we're 4 years out and 6 years out from the first couple units that will be removed from service there. Back in 2015, we had a similar coal plant removal from service in Utah, so we've worked through that process in the past. But the transition for us to serve across our 6 states is really to balance timing, the community impacts, and provide a source of economic development in areas where we may be removing a very key tax base driver and coming back to that same community and saying, we're going to repurpose this set of infrastructure. It's going to look a heck of a lot different than it does today, but we're thinking about the communities and the employees there. PacifiCorp, we serve 1.9 million customers. Our peak load, just to kind of help, I know there's a lot of megawatt thinkers in here. We peak in the summer at about 10 gigawatts of load across our system. 2/3 of that serves Utah. I'm sorry, yeah, 2/3 of that serves Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho, and then 1/3 serves the western states, the Pacific Power States. So just to kind of give you an idea of where that load is, 40% of our system is effectively the Salt Lake Valley, if you will. So our transition is really focused on, going greener. Salt Lake, for those of you that some may or may not know, has an airshed issue, particularly in the winter. We have an inversion. We effectively sit in a bowl surrounded by mountain ranges. That inversion can be very detrimental to public health and so forth. We don't have, from a emissions sources perspective, we don't have a lot in the valley. We have everything kind of south and east. But nonetheless, we're trying to find solutions for that problem in the valley as best we can, which for us goes from everywhere from, utility scale solutions where you're building new renewable installations, whether it's wind, solar, storage, but down to electrification of apartment buildings that are being built in the valley, working on deployment of basically residential sized batteries that we can integrate into our systems and manage as a load source in certain pockets in the Wasatch Front. And those seem kind of small, on the broader scheme of things when we're talking about 10 gigawatts of power that needs to be managed, but we're focused pretty much top to bottom because ultimately every little thing we do plays into that ask that we're getting from our customer groups. The customer ask is much different today than it was even 3, 4, 5 years ago. Whether it's the residential drive to be greener, at that level. But we've had knocks on the doors from industrial customers that 5 years ago would not have said, I need to find a way to get green and I need to do it quicker. We're looking to kind of break down that vertically integrated utility paradigm that, you're not a solution provider. We are, and we're becoming a solutions provider more and more at all levels of our company. So that transition kind of touches on a little bit of everything. I'll probably stop there because we can talk much more about it. But that's where we're headed.
Well, thanks. So Chad referenced political leadership, Sarah, and I think New Mexico saw a real change. Governor Martinez was term limited, right? And Governor Lujan Grisham is elected in November of 18. You have your 2019 session, and there was a lot that happened in that session that impacts energy transitions. And now you've just finished a second session. This was 30 days, but would you describe sort of those first 2 legislative sessions and the governor's agenda on driving a transition?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to be here as well. So for Governor Lujan Grisham, energy policy and greening our system was a huge priority coming into January 2019. And there had been some announcements that sort of paved the way to set up a big deal in terms of legislation. Our biggest utility, PNM, had announced that they didn't feel like the San Juan Generating Station, which is a coal-fired plant in the Farmington area, was economic, and that they wanted to potentially get out of that plant. That plant is not in their service territory. So that creates some very interesting community dynamics about replacement power and how are we going to do this and what are we going to do. So legislation the year before us had failed to set up a securitization and replacement power scenario. So we took the opportunity to work with the sponsor of that legislation, bring all the parties to the table, and really hammer out comprehensive energy policy legislation in 2019. It's called the Energy Transition Act. It sets the state on a course to 80% renewable energy by 2040 and 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050, and even earlier for the IOUs. And in fact, PNM has said they can meet it even earlier than the bill said. Now, unfortunately, Duane was not in his chair at that time. It might have been even more ambitious if Duane had been there, but he came on board after our session ended. But anyway, the good news is TriState's on track also to meet this legislation. The bill also included securitization, which I know that Colorado is familiar with as well, a way to pay for the transition, not just the replacement power, but also to put some dollars back into the community that's affected by the retiring generation. So that is a huge bill. It shows very clearly where our state is going on electricity generation and policy. But it's not the only thing that we need to do. And so We have started a number of conversations also about regional electricity markets. We know that New Mexico has a lot of export opportunity, particularly of our renewable energy, and we want to be that clean energy engine for the West. That's going to take more transmission. It's going to take more systems in place. So that's something that we're very much looking forward to working on throughout this year. This legislative session, 2020, we also passed legislation to reinstate our rooftop solar. Doesn't have to be on a roof, but our distributed solar tax credit that will come back. That's a $6,000 credit max for folks who choose to go solar. We also passed grid modernization legislation. So that bill requires us to, my department, to come up with a roadmap on how to transition our grid from the big stuff like regional markets down to smart meters and distribution. So we look forward to rolling up our sleeves on that. It also set up a grant program to allow us to access some federal dollars that we felt like we were leaving on the table. And then finally, it clarified how our utilities and encouraged our utilities to bring forward grid modernization proposals to our Public Regulation Commission to get going on that. The heartbreaker of the session was that we didn't get our electric vehicle tax credit bill over the finish line. It got caught up in some end of session politics, to make a long story short. But I expect that we'll continue to work on that going forward. So we're looking at everything. All ideas are on the table. We look forward to your ideas. Please come visit me in Santa Fe, and
It's a good place to visit.
it's a good place to visit. The chili's great. I won't get into the Colorado, New Mexico
not get
chili
into
war.
that.
I know, it's really dangerous.
It's
My
pretty
boss
good
has
chili.
that covered. It's really good. But I think we have a really good working relationship with the utilities and also with other providers, and that's been really important to helping achieve some of these ambitious goals.
So how important then is grid modernization to PacifiCorp, Chad? Because you operate in so many states, you're going to build new renewables, you're shutting down coal, and there are a lot of different things that rubric fits, grid modernization. But how much do utilities think about that?
Yeah, we think about it every day. And I think I'll break it into a couple different pieces. Because we're so diverse from a geographic perspective and our resources, if you look at Wyoming wind, obviously strong resource, Utah solar, strong resource, but not necessarily co-located with our existing coal plants or our existing substations, et cetera. So on the grid modernization front, we've been at it for about a decade, because as you can imagine, in the West, a lot of federal property, a lot of state property. That federal piece in particular is difficult to get major transmission and infrastructure projects passed through. So we feel like we've been leading out, but it seems like it takes forever. So we've got some work to do on that front. But I would say with the successes we've had on that front, we're currently building about 140 miles of 500 kV, basically backbone transmission across the southern part of Wyoming, facilitating implementation of 1,150 megawatts of wind to be connected to our system. That'll all be complete this year. The next major piece of that, kind of leveraging that work that we've been doing for about a decade, is a piece that we call Gateway South, that kind of runs from that same area of Wyoming down crosses a little bit of Colorado and down into Utah to our load service or our load center. Obviously, that's a larger effort, about 400 miles of 500 kV. But there again, that starts to build for us around that, that 2/3 of our system that I mentioned, a triangle, if you will, which creates all sorts of opportunities for localized economic development, whether it's solar storage, serving new data centers that are rolling in. We've created a tremendously increased amount of transfer capability in the West, just on those couple of projects. We also have major transmission projects headed towards our Pacific Northwest part of our system. There again, permitted and effectuated over the course of about a decade. So a lot of major transmission teed up on the grid modernization front, largely because of just the way we're situated across the system. We have load pockets and a long way between them. But on the smaller scale, we've started to deploy some storage and solar installations on a very small scale, say 5 megawatt hours, 2 megawatts, if you will, that have actually supplanted some transmission solutions in remote areas across Utah. So we've got one of those that's up and running, just put into commercial operation here in the last month. We have some others. We have one at Oregon State University, same kind of a concept. Can we create a renewable storage solution that replaces a traditional poles and wires solution? So those are much smaller scale, but if I play kind of down the grid modernization front, very key to our system in learning from those initial installations and then building upon that as we move forward. We've also talked a little bit about electric vehicle infrastructure. We were able to leverage a DOE grant across a number of partners in Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, up into the Oregon system, that we've actually deployed 1,200 charging ports across our system. First focused on basically mitigating range anxiety across Utah to effectuate access to the national parks. So from an infrastructure perspective, very key set of projects that's been leveraged up to about $20 million of infrastructure now. But there again, modernizing the grid, electrifying the grid where we can, improving emissions across our service territory. So some there again, relatively small scale. I know 20 million seems like a lot. If you break it across 1,200 charging points, it's a lot of local installations, if you will. So those are also important to us and opportunities that we'll continue to pursue, basically to meet that customer ask for, what's the next best way to minimize our emissions and serve the customer need.
So, Duane, I've got two questions for you, but let's just segue there. Part of your responsible energy plan is also charging stations.
Yes.
Why don't you just talk a little bit about the thinking that goes into that?
So just briefly, the electric co-ops serve some of the most remote areas, and if you're going to drive across Colorado, or particularly Western Slope, there's not a lot of dots on that map when you look for charging stations. So just having something in every one of our member co-ops territory was what our goal was. To get two charging stations in every one of those cooperatives territory helps fill in the gaps in western Nebraska and across Wyoming, and then especially Western Slope, Colorado, and New Mexico. So we'll be having 2 charging stations in each member system's area that'll help make
Pretty
that.
interesting. A couple years ago, the governor of Wyoming, Matt Mead, was on a stage at CSU. I was moderating a panel, and I asked him why he would be supporting charging stations from a coal and oil and gas state. And he said, coal was their number 1 industry, but their number 2 industry is recreational tourism. And it's, again, sort of matching it with your industry. It's fulfilling people's desire to be able to drive an electric car across the West.
Today, it's also economic development, and it won't be ultimately, but today, if you're driving an electric car, you're looking to stop at places where you can charge. Having a high-speed charging station in a rural community at the local downtown area is going to help drive some economic activity there as well.
The second question I had for you, you deliver power in 4 states. You have a facility in Arizona, but different states, different policies, different political leadership. And so this transition plan that you've announced, how much is that driven by the market, and how much is it driven by different policies that come from states when there are elections and people, the leadership changes hands?
As you could imagine, there's a different view on energy policy from Wyoming than there is in Colorado or New Mexico. And Nebraska and Wyoming tend to think differently than Colorado and New Mexico. And for us, with members in all 4 states, and we're governed by that democratically elected board that cares a lot about reliability first and affordability next, we had to make sure we were being true to that. That's our mission. And the way we were able to make this work in terms of energy transition was to cash in on the green energy dividend, which is the fact that new renewables are coming in so much below the operating cost of any fossil fuel unit that it gives us the headroom to be able to accelerate the decommissioning of coal and not have upward rate pressure. So that was the key to getting agreement across the TriState network, is that we had to be able to look at our Nebraska and Wyoming members and say, this is not raising your rates. I think that was the key to getting that agreement. And even when we met with the Wyoming governor's office, and believe me, there is definitely a distinct difference in policy there. They talked about, well, if things happen in Colorado because of a Colorado law or because of a New Mexico law that are driving TriState's costs up, we might be interested in passing a law in Wyoming that would require resource planning approvals in Wyoming. And wouldn't it be interesting if the state of Wyoming wouldn't approve a plan that reduced coal generation that the state of Colorado would approve? And where would that put TriState as an interstate utility? So the secret to this was to be able to say to them, to the leadership in those other states, we're not going to raise your rates because of this. We're going to move as fast as we can to a green energy economy without raising rates. And what makes that possible is the fact that we can source utility scale renewables now well below 2 cents a kilowatt hour, well below. In fact, think almost half. And so at those kind of costs, where we're looking at 2.5 to 4.5 cents as the marginal operating cost of coal or natural gas, you can see there's a savings.
So Sarah, when we did our renewable portfolio standard in Colorado, we did it 3 different times. We had a carve out for distributed generation, and to ensure that there was some market for that as a part of an RPS. Does that exist in New Mexico with your new RPS? Was there any distributed carve out?
Distributed carve-out in New Mexico has always been something that the commission sort of inserted. It's not in the actual statute in New Mexico, so it's sort of a policy choice made at the commission level. There's still a huge appetite. A lot of people just want to know exactly where their power is coming from, and they want to know that it's from the system on their roof or on their property. And there's also a lot of interest in community solar, which I think is something we'll be working on this year too for people who can't have it right at their property. So that market is really robust. We saw when our tax credit that we just reinstated, when it went away the last time, we lost about a quarter of the solar jobs in New Mexico. So there's a pretty direct correlation between policy and economics and the market. And I think we're kind of coming back to that sweet spot where those things mesh up between consumer demand and the incentives that are available and the workers who want to work in this new energy economy. So
I do want to ask you about that because I think Chad referenced it, but you are also doing a lot of work on what we call sort of the just transition in coal-dependent communities. And it's Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico, all have some flavor of it. Utah, where there, generations, multiple generations have been in the coal mines or in coal-fired generation. And now there's a shutdown happening, and it's really prevalent in New Mexico. What are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of working with communities that are experiencing that?
It's a hard conversation for sure. I mean, you're right. It's not just a job; it's a culture and a history, and it's a very emotional thing when these plants shut down, and you have to think about, okay, what happens next. So, for New Mexico, it depends on the community, and I think that's true across all the different states. I mean, the right solution for the San Juan plant area is different than the right solution for the Escalante plant area. And I'll talk about what looks different there versus Colorado, which is yet again a different flavor. So in San Juan, PNM felt like being able to use securitization and generating those additional dollars would enable tens of millions of dollars they could plow back into worker training, severance packages, and community transition there. So the state is very involved through the Energy Transition Act and the processes it's set up through the Economic Development Department, the Department of Workforce Solutions, and the Indian Affairs Department, because don't forget, a lot of those workers are residents of the Navajo Nation. So those are different types of pressures and considerations than you have in other places that don't have that diversity. So for San Juan, it's a combination of the dollars that are generated through the securitization, as well as other things that the community might identify. Right now, they're exploring carbon capture for the plant. I don't know where that's going to go and if the economics are going to work out, but they're very interested in that. They're trying to diversify their outdoor recreation economy, and so there are other tools for that. So it really, it has to be about the place. With Escalante, it turns out that the chair of the House Appropriations and Finance Committee is an economic development professional. She felt like a different model would work for Escalante. Securitization isn't really something that TriState can take advantage of. So we had to find a different tool, and legislation passed this session that would create a different kind of economic development district that could, figure out what to do with the plant and the infrastructure and, go from there. So you kind of have to solve in a place-based way.
I'm going to ask Duane for you to comment on that as well, because Escalante, Nuclear, and now you're 10 years away from the last of the closures that'll happen in Colorado. How does a major interstate utility then think about the impact to those coal-dependent communities?
Well, that was the key for our board as they talked about the responsible energy plan. One of the key considerations was what about the communities These were their friends and neighbors, people who've been employees at TriState for a long time. When you think about our commitment to close all the coal we operate, that means cutting the company in half in terms of employment base. So we have 1,500 employees, 600 of them are directly involved in coal mining or coal burning. And so it's a pretty big commitment to say we're going to make that kind of a change to the company. And it's not just a change to the company, it's a change to those communities. So Escalante is a community, Grants, New Mexico, largely dependent on the jobs out of the plant there, 107 very good paying jobs and have been that way for decades. I want to nod to the leadership in New Mexico for their forward thinking and what they've done with House Bill 8, which just passed, as a model for transition for communities. What we saw when we went down there and started talking with Representative Lundstrom, who's the chair of the appropriations there, she had a plan and had been thinking about it for 5 years and had been working with the local economic development groups for the previous 5 years. What they had said in New Mexico was, we know these coal plants aren't going to be around forever and we need to be thinking ahead, even though there hasn't been an announcement from the company. And it was a very sudden announcement coming from TriState to say by the end of the year we would be closing that plant. The economics were just so horribly out of favor for the plant that it was something we needed to do for affordability for the rest of our members and to help us with that transition. So I'm pleased to see that they've been thinking about it. I think we have the time. The first unit at Craig retires 5 years from now, and then all the units by 10 years from now. We have the time to be thinking about this. Really proud of the plant manager there at Craig. He has been communicating with his employees saying it's not out of your control. You have 5 years before the first unit retires. TriState's very generous in its retirement plans. You can put additional money into those plans. If you're close to retirement, you can be planning on your retirement. If you're not close to your retirement, we have liberalized our education policy where we'll pay 100% of your degree, no requirement to pay it back. If you find a job immediately upon completion of the degree and go to work for somebody else, we're fine with that. We're going to help you make that transition. And what the board's approved for the employees at Escalante is over a year's salary, $109,000 is the average compensation package for a departing power plant worker, which helps them with that transition. It's just all part of this very, very important community transition question. What happens to a community that is so 100% dependent today on those jobs? And, you know, it's in the public interest to walk away from coal. It's in the collective public interest. But the people who are bearing the brunt of that decision, it's inordinately being borne by just a few communities. And again, third generation miners, it's not just as simple as saying, we'll just retrain them. You know, they'll just get a different job. And it's a pretty complex question and one we want to be involved in. Another area where we've seen an opportunity is to reinvest in local renewables, just as Chad was talking about. So at Escalante,
Glad you mentioned that.
yeah, there's $200 million solar project that's going to go on the plant site. It helps McKinley County with the loss of its tax base. In Craig, Colorado, we've announced 125 megawatts, and that's just the first of probably many tranches of renewables. And then further, we'd like to look at developing a storage park there. If you look at the grid, the characteristics of the grid, number one place on the grid for putting storage in the West today is Craig, Colorado, just because of congestion and the way it's situated. So it looks to be a place where we can develop a significant amount of storage going forward.
Great. So Chad, 9 different governors in America last year ran on a promise of either 100% renewable or 100% clean. Some of them said, no, it doesn't all have to be renewable, but it's going to be carbon free. I think Arizona Public Service was the 15th or 16th major investor-owned utility that made their own announcement about getting to 100% carbon neutral or carbon free by 2050. They've got an 80% goal. So how are we going to get to 100% in a way where it is still reliable and affordable? And you don't have to actually have an answer to this. Most people who make those goals say we don't have the answer. What's the pathway in the mind of a major utility to be planning now for a 2050 zero carbon?
Yeah. You know, I think you're, to some extent, if you lay out the technologies that we know today and you lay out your loads and you model, throw all sorts of modeling at it, you know, as we look forward, and if you look at our integrated resource plan that's publicly available, when we're out into that 2050 timeframe from a what do we have planned resource-wise, we're in that 90% reduction. So everybody's going to say, well, how do we get that last 10%? And I think that's the ask. How do we get that last 10%? And what is the technology, the system, you know, control, the the new process within which you're going to operate your system to get that last bit covered off. And I would say from a PacifiCorp perspective, we haven't announced a 100% goal because we've focused on, we can lay out the 90, we know how we could get there, and we're going to go after that last 10%. So, and I think that's kind of similar to a lot of the other comments that you'll hear. There's targets out there. But I think there has to be another change, another step change on, if you look at our system, we've got 600 megawatts of storage, primarily focused on battery, that we've identified coming into our system by 2023. Well, that's a big lift from where we're at today. Largely dependent on folks like you in the room to respond to our request for proposals and submit, technology solutions that actually get you there. But I do think there'll be changes. If you look across our system, you'll see, right now we identify a lot of battery. But there's also great opportunities for pumped hydro, for Ks, for hydrogen storage. There's other opportunities out there that on balance will have to be melded to get to a point where you have more options and more flexibility to cover that last 10%. Because intermittency will be an issue. It is an issue. It's the sun only shines when it shines and the wind only blows when it blows. And nobody can guarantee that. So I think you have to find those intermittent technologies. There will be, with the amount of interest in this area, there will be technology advancements. But we're yet to say this is how we get to that final 10%.
Our center mapped all the coal in the west and looking at coal plants that are coming offline. It's interesting, there's no new net natural gas. There's new builds on natural gas, but other natural gas has come offline. The replacement is largely renewables.
Yep.
In the rest of the country, it's natural gas. 75% of the new build is natural gas. So we have some advantages in the west, but I think that 100% question is going to be a really interesting one.
Yep.
So I'm going to turn to you, Sarah, and ask you, when you are a policymaker, and maybe you should be asking me this question because I did the same thing.
Let's go.
When you're a policymaker, how are you going to get to 80? How are you going to get to 100? And how much does a political figure like your boss think about that? She's going to probably not be in office. She might be a senator or president of the United States or something then, but she won't be the governor of New Mexico. How much do you think about that 2040 and 2050 goal and how hard they're going to be to get to?
Well, you have to think about it. I mean, you can't set something that everyone immediately says is impossible and, you shouldn't do it because then they're not going to work towards it and they're going to prove you wrong. So, we had to work with the utilities on what targets and timetables would be a stretch, but within the realm of the possible. And I will say, in 2007, I was working for then Governor Bill Ritter in New Mexico, and we passed a Renewable Energy Transmission Authority bill, setting up an authority to help build transmission lines for renewables. And very seasoned, very sober, very responsible utility professionals said at that time that the requirement in that bill that any project that RETA funded had to have 30% renewables on the line. A lot of people said, we don't know if we can do that. And now look where we are today, and this is a routine. Nobody's even talking about that. Nobody's even really talking about 50. After 50, then we start having conversations. So it's not that I'm just going to roll the dice and say, well, I think we can get there, but I think history has proven that technology, you set ambitious goals, technology and creative thinking follows and helps achieve that, sometimes ahead of target. And so I really have a lot of confidence that we're going to be able to get there with technology improvements, with new systems, with new creativity and new policies where we need it.
So TriState has a goal, a
Yes.
2040 goal. The governor of Colorado, Governor Polis, for those of you from outside the state, has said we're going to have 100% renewable by 2040. But he doesn't want to do it with a renewable portfolio standard, and he doesn't. And we have climate legislation that's 2030. Doesn't like cap and trade. He's been very clear about that. Wrote an op-ed recently in the Pueblo Chieftain where he reiterated that. So he still says 100% renewable, and you have a 100% goal by 2040 that comports with that. How are you going to get there, Duane?
Well, so like everybody else, we'd say we don't know for sure, but I'll tell you some things we know are going to happen. One is there's going to eventually be a market in the West. It's going to be required because in order to integrate the amount of renewables as we get beyond 50%, we need to look at broader and broader geographic areas, and there'll be surplus renewables at certain times of the day, certain times of the week that can be moved to other parts of the grid, but only if we have that ability to manage the grid as one grid or maybe two in the West And that requires an RTO. So once we have the RTO structure in place, which I think we can get within 5 years if we work hard, we also have to admit that there's going to be times when we have extremely large amounts of surplus renewable generation. The cost of renewables has gotten so low, there's an incentive for just about everyone to add solar, and that in order to save money on their utility bill, right? So as everybody does that, there's going to be times a day, and you think about that mild April day when it's very sunny, there's going to be surplus generation. And we can just dump that or we can do something useful with it. So that begs the cost of storage. Now, batteries are interesting, and everybody talks about batteries. But batteries are linear with duration, and they always will be. So if you want a 2-hour battery, it costs twice as much as a 1-hour battery. If you want an 8-hour battery, it costs 8 times as much as a 1-hour battery. And it's always going to be that way. What technologies can we do with storage that can get us beyond that just linear cost curve? And we need something that's not linear with duration. And why I say that is we have to be able to maintain reliability during those really difficult weeks when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. Those happen sometimes in the winter. And we need a replacement for a coal pile, something that looks like that 30-day supply of storage we have on the ground gives us great confidence today that we can operate the grid. But if we're going to get to 100%, we need something that has dispatchability over long duration, over several days of duration. And we can do that with batteries, but we might instead take the surplus generation that's being dumped for free, or even somebody might be paying us to take it under a market construct, and store that. Now, does that look like either a flow battery, which is not linear with respect to size, it's much lower cost incrementally, or maybe it's hydrogen, but even hydrogen has some cost with it, or maybe it's conversion to ammonia, which is a very known quantity. We know how to deal with ammonia, transport ammonia, store ammonia. You can do that in very large tanks on site and have the equivalent of a synthetic coal pile, and ammonia can be burned back into hydrogen, water vapor, nitrogen at the end of the day. A completely green fuel cycle, and that's the research we want to encourage today, is how we get to that nonlinear bulk utility scale storage solution.
Well said. So, Chad, I think Wyoming presently is considering a tax on solar, build out of solar. Is that utility scale or distributed or both?
I think yet to be determined. I think it's focused on utility scale, but the best of my understanding of the draft bills that are out there. It's very similar to the Wyoming tax on wind. I think it's established as proposed at $1 per megawatt hour, which is the same as the wind production tax in Wyoming. So and I think you're seeing some of that in Wyoming politically, obviously very much impacted by the announcements on the coal front that we've made and we've talked about already. So some policies being reactionary. I would also say Wyoming has taken an approach of wanting to get ahead of and maybe control the amount of development on the renewables front in that state in fits and starts. We built a lot of wind in Wyoming about 10 years ago, about a decade ago. And we're really bringing the counties, the communities, even the state industrial siting process along, as that emerging technology at that time was being deployed. I think we're seeing the same thing on the solar front right now. Not a lot of solar in Wyoming. I think there's been some missteps on some of the development that has happened in Wyoming. So there's kind of this reactionary policy making that's going on to some extent, but at the same time, trying to find ways to identify revenue streams. If you think about the amount of coal what is happening in Wyoming, not just because of PacifiCorp and the folks up here, but the broader coal market and the economy that's driving this change, or the economics that is driving this change, that's a significant revenue stream for that state. So a lot of work being done just to try to plug that gap as that transition continues. Obviously for us, as we kind of work through that, from a kind of responsible development perspective, it's imperative on not only us as a utility, but those in the room that are working on the development front to be responsible, so that we don't have missteps or feedback from leadership in given states that, hey, you're not doing it right, because that does not help as we're embarking. For example, we have mid-year this year, we'll be out to the market for about 3,000 megawatts of solar across our system, 600 megawatts of storage that I talked about, 3,500 megawatts of wind-ish, across the system. That's a big ask as far as, potential opportunities for economic development, but also for development on the ground and impacting things like wildlife corridors, migration paths, and a sage grouse habitat, and all the things you need to think about in the West. And to be responsible in that arena is critically important to continue the momentum on the transitions that we've all talked about up here today.
I think Idaho is 66% public lands. Took them 13 years to permit a transmission line. It was an interstate transmission line, came in from Montana, but 13 years. And, the West, we deal with those challenges. Colorado's 45% public lands. You know what you are, Sarah?
It's a lot.
Yeah, and Wyoming's, I think, 45 or 46. Nevada's 85%. So those are big challenges when you're building out transmission. You referred to it a little bit before. There is now a story about they built solar in an antelope migration pattern in Wyoming without doing, I think, all their homework. And this is really a really big mistake, I think, in the West to not consider those kinds of things. So, Duane, I'd like to ask you how much you think distributed generation solar will be part of your portfolio in another 10 or 15 years. This is a solar and storage conference. We talked about stuff broadly, but we're going to bring it down to solar and storage a little bit better now.
I think at the retail level right now, most consumers can save money with local solar. So that's the first thing is there's an economic driver here. It's no longer just a green energy driver. So we recognize that's going to happen. Also, our members, we have 43 different cooperative members across these 4 states, and they've said they want more local control and more ability to develop local renewable projects in their area, not just the 100 megawatt utility scale that's serving all of them, but something that they can point to in their area that helps with local development and local reliability. So TriState made a bylaw change in April, and we have a committee of the members that's been working every month since then trying to develop the rules under which that would happen. So I believe you'll see in April our board announcing their decision to establish a set of rules under which members can develop local renewable projects.
And when you say members, you mean the local co-op
Member
members
cooperatives. And
who
so-
are members of TriState.
Right. Those are the projects that would fall in the range of half a megawatt to 10 megawatts or even 20 megawatts projects, not the 100 megawatt utility scale projects.
What do you think the appetite will be for co-ops when that happens?
Well, I think absolutely they're going to do it based on the feedback we've received from members. And that's part of the reason why I believe we're going to ultimately get to a point where we're overbuilt on renewables some parts of the year, and storage will be the next step of that answer as we develop the storage solution.
So Sarah, again, let's talk a little bit about that. You referenced community solar and that you might be working on community solar. How much in your vision of what we look like in 2030, 2035, 2040, is it going to be some mix of utility scale, community, and distributed solar and storage?
I think it will be. I think there's a big lesson for the community solar advocates this year in New Mexico. That legislation, a couple of different bills did not make it over the finish line. And I think part of why that happened is because there were several different ideas about why this was important. For some people, it's about cleaning the grid. Okay, so we passed the Energy Transition Act. That's going to clean up the utility scale grid, and that's a good thing. Maybe not as fast as some people would like, but if that's your sort of rationale, then it becomes somewhat less because of the ETA. If it's not just a choice between coal and solar. If you are interested in it as a different business model or as more of a customer choice perspective, I think that's probably the sweet spot right now in New Mexico, looking towards the next year of just how do we get these types of projects in. It's different companies in a lot of cases. That's interesting and attractive and gives people choice. And then there's also has been a school of thought that these projects are for low income customers, and I think they can be designed and developed to accommodate that a little bit, but I think we have a lot more negotiation to do with the utilities on how that would actually look. So community solar in New Mexico, where it landed was a study. The legislature passed a memorial requiring a study, a working group and a study this summer, and I'm sure we'll be part of it, and maybe some of you will be part of that, and I think that will be a really, really good to just take the temperature down, try to figure out exactly what are we trying to accomplish, how can we do it in a way that doesn't screw up other things that we're doing under the ETA, but also provide the kinds of positive benefits and choices that people are looking for. So I think that's what we hope to accomplish this year.
So we're going to go to questions from the audience. We've had a nice discussion about transition, and as I sit here, I think about how this conversation would not have even been dreamed about 10 years ago, really.
It's true.
That these kinds of announcements were happening, that this kind of public policy was passed, not just in New Mexico, but throughout the West and in other parts of the country. And this is your chance now to ask a question of any of these three. If you just want to stand up and kind of, there's a microphone coming around.
Good morning, thank you. Captain Richard Burt, Las Vegas Fire and Rescue, and I work with Sunrun. I do a SAFE program for firefighters on battery safety. Actually, I've got a program this afternoon. But my question is this. I just got back from Puerto Rico, and I'm in disaster relief, looking at the grid and the failures in California. And as I said, I was 2 weeks on the ground in Puerto Rico after the hurricane. Now, 30 years in the fire service, when the grid goes down, we see deaths. And we see deaths on a massive scale. And the question for the utilities is, we're at a point with this technology, and everybody in this room would agree, we're at a point where microgrids and point-of-use electricity is going to be the solution. But with that solution, what's going to happen is the grids, the large utility companies are going to have to release that 100-year-old model of producing large amounts of electricity, shareholders, and then pushing the electricity out.
Why don't we take that and turn it into a question then? It was a question, I get it, but
Yeah, that's my question.
I'm going to bring it back to the panelists.
Where is that release, the understanding for the utility to say, okay, we're going to step back and just be a provider of electrons moving?
Well, let's ask them the question then. So Duane, do you think that's right? Do you agree with that?
Well, I'd like to engage in a thought experiment with you. So reliability is job one for us, and we absolutely agree with you. If we don't do our job, people die. And that's why I'm so concerned about that winter week and how we replace the coal pile reliability with something that's just as reliable on utility scale. So the thought experiment goes like this. You want to put in a microgrid so you have local reliability. And your neighboring city also wants to have a microgrid for local reliability, right? And what you'll quickly say is, but if my microgrid goes down and my neighboring city has some surplus, maybe they'd want to sell it to me when my microgrid's down. So wouldn't it be more reliable if you tied those two microgrids together? And then do you think it might be more reliable if you took 20 microgrids and tied them together? And do you think it might be even more reliable if you tied all the cities in the West together in a grid? And that's what we have today. And that's why we have it, is for reliability. So I think there's always going to be a role for the grid as a backbone and enabler of renewables. I've said for many years, solar energy is brought to you by coal because coal has been the thing that filled in the gaps and allowed that renewables to function on the grid. In the future, solar will be brought to you by storage because we're always going to have reliability first. I'm not sure if I directly answered your question, but
Well, it's a fair point because there is this concern about PG&E in California, even Southern California Edison, and the reliability of the grid there has a lot to do with different kinds of things, different problems that have started forest fires, and now the potential for bankruptcy. Puerto Rico with a natural disaster, you have increasing numbers of natural disasters, then the grid can be somewhat vulnerable to that. And so I'm going to Chad, and ask
I'll
you
just
to
maybe
respond.
bolt on a little bit because I agree with your statement. I think what we've started to do from a critical infrastructure perspective is as part of our planning with those entities, whether it's a transit authority or the local hospital network or critical infrastructure in the Salt Lake Valley, for example. We've sat down with those folks and we said, as we're planning and as bids roll in on storage and intermittent resources, et cetera, what are your needs? From a grid resilience, emergency response, we sit on a fault line in Salt Lake City. So how would we make sure that we get you back on in a reliable way? We're having those discussions. So I don't think it's so much disconnect from the utility as it is, are there other ways to be thinking about this resilience going forward as there are more and more technologies deployed across the system? Because inherently, there will be more distributed resources of some sort, some ilk. And can they be positioned to actually support the ask around the critical infrastructure? So we're having those types of discussions because I think that's a valid point, and that way we're all being thoughtful at the same time versus in silos as far as where we're deploying resources.
And these types of considerations are specifically called out in our new grid modernization legislation too.
These kinds of considerations around
cybersecurity and those types of things.
Yeah, that's one of the things we haven't talked about, and I don't know that we'll go down that rabbit hole, but cybersecurity is this really important conversation in the United States involving utilities and policymakers. Other questions? Yes, sir.
To a 10 megawatt. But the data shows the utility scale, as you mentioned, sub 2 cents is 3 to 4 times more economical.
Yes.
How you justify that?
I don't. So I'm the G&T guy, and my job is to provide reliable and affordable power for the 43 members that we serve. So that means we're looking at utility scale solar and wind, which comes in well below 2 cents. Those smaller projects aren't below 2 cents. They're more like 3.5, 4.5 cents. But our members, who we work for, they own us, okay? We're a cooperative owned by our members. When our local member says we're willing to pay more because it's that important to us to have it locally, we say yes. It's not about economics, it's about other attributes, the fact that there's local economic development, the fact that there's a local generation project of some kind that does, to some extent, improve reliability.
Hi, Jonathan Rogers with the City and County of Denver. Chad, question for you. You mentioned having residential storage systems that PacifiCorp can tap into to help with demand response. As we look towards the future, we're in a fortunate position. We get to write our own building codes. We can require that thermal loads, EV charging, energy storage systems have grid controllable units on them. But how has your relationship with your customers evolved? How have regulatory frameworks evolved? How do you make sure that you can compensate and incentivize the customer to participate in these programs while also keeping the utility financially whole and not having that disincentive to pay them for their services, essentially?
Yeah, I think, and that's a great question, because the example that we have, it ultimately will be a 12 megawatt set of batteries. It's spread over 600 units. And I can tell you that as we dove into that development opportunity, if you were going to try to just pencil that out on its face, it's not going to play. It's too expensive to do it that way. But that individual developer said, this is my concept around this development. You know, I have the right customer base to fill this resource. So I think there's work to be done there. Ultimately, the way we did that is we contracted that under an innovative technology kind of rider in Utah that allowed us to engage in that discussion around that specific development and deployment of, it's basically on-site solar and on-site storage. We have another similar installation of a completely electrified apartment complex that's going in across the city. And in that case, the developer came to us and said, I'd like to subscribe to your subscriber solar program, which is a 20 megawatt utility scale solar resource, not co-located in the Salt Lake Valley, but southern Utah. That one on paper actually pencils out. So it really comes down to what is the ask. You know, the customer came to us in each instance and said, I have a concept that I'm going to deploy. How can you engage with me as the utility and put together a successful solution? So we've seen kind of both spectrums. One went utility scale, one went localized. I think on the localized level, if you were going to spec that in or make that codify, whether it's electrification or storage, you're going to have to work through the economics there, because it is a challenge when you get that set of distributed energy and the need for us to be able to control it, because that's not a simple ask either for the battery manufacturers. So it's a unique solution. I think there's work to do there, to your point. I'd be glad to talk to you and line you up with the folks that kind of ran through the details on that, if you'd be interested in that.
But I think it makes the point, right, that, and we saw the folks who are the sponsors of this conference, and they have their own pathway to 2030, how similar they were. But there's an emerging of policies involving the built environment, the delivery of electricity, and clean grids and grid modernization to have beneficial electrification as a watchword for TriState now. That's really something, right? That's a big change. and it's happening, but it means that it's not going to be the built environment here, electric generation here, and in transportation here, it's going to be a merging of those three things into one. Okay, we have time maybe for one more question.
Martin Walker with the Colorado Renewable Energy Society and New Energy Colorado. My question is about pumped hydro, because that has also been mentioned here. We have an upcoming speaker from NREL, Greg Stark, who says there's a number of other pumped hydro solutions that aren't as big, that are easy to deploy and not as expensive. What is your take on the role of pumped hydro for storage?
You know, from PacifiCorp's perspective, we look at any technology. The projects that we tend to see come to us from the developer ranks has been larger scale. So if there's smaller scale, more than happy to talk through that and get educated on that front. I think across the West, there's opportunities. They are obviously locationally driven. You have to have the right, you know, topography to make that work. But on the you know, back to duration of dispatch, flexibility, hugely flexible. It brings scale that, you know, potentially if you're bringing in small battery modules across your system versus a, you know, 300 megawatt pumped hydro system. Once you have enough penetration of intermittent resources, that becomes very, very key, having that level of scale. So that's why we're looking at those. I would say the glide path to a pumped hydro project is nowhere, you know, it's much, much longer than, hey, I'm going to develop a solar battery installation. So you have to bring that balance too, because they're much more complex to get permitted and built, much more capital intensive. It's not an incremental type of project. It's a full-on major investment. So it has to be right for your system.
Duane, you want to respond?
Just say that everything you said is perfect. We're definitely interested in every kind of storage, and pump storage has the advantage of long duration possibility.
Okay, we had one more question. This gentleman here had his hand up right in front. So the question is, what are we doing to fully electrify the building stock, both for heating purposes and everything else, cooling purposes? And what's the technology that's being thought about?
Heat pump, advanced heat pump, air-to-air, even advanced air-to-air heat pump operates at much lower temperatures, and heat pump water heaters are two of the great technologies that are available now, well-proven and cost-effective.
The question is, what are they doing to incentivize that, and how is the grid prepared for that future?
Well, as a wholesale provider, we don't incent the retail systems, so that would come to our retail co-ops to actually make that incentive for their members.
Yeah, so, and we do have, PacifiCorp has demand side management type programs and other incentives that we've worked through. We have in particular in Utah, we have a program called Sustainable Transportation and Energy Program. It was legislation we ran a while back, which has facilitated some of that, you know, ability to fund some of those types of technologies. On the example that I made with respect to the apartment complex, I would ask you to take a look at the Give Group. The Give Group is the developer of that all-electric installation in Salt Lake City. You know, once through water heaters, heat pumps, et cetera. That's a pretty impressive example, if you will. Also integrating EV charging, those types of things, which we also do have programs to incentivize folks to deploy chargers. So I think it really, from our perspective, operating across 6 states, it really depends on the state. Each state kind of manages their, what I'm going to call demand side, or I'll just roll it into demand side management programs a little bit differently as far as what incentives are offered and where. From a grid, you know, ability perspective, we're looking at that, you know, as new developments come on, we reassess our grid. As new storage comes on, we'll reassess the grid. The interesting thing about, you know, if you look at our current integrated resource plan, there's going to be a lot of storage dispersed across 6 states, and we're constantly reassessing that underlying backbone on the ability to maintain reliability, integrate those resources, and make sure we're watching, you know, where are the load pockets and load growth in the system.
Well, thank you. Let's give a show of appreciation for our panelists, for Sarah, Duane, and Chad. Thank you all.